Hey guys, this is Mr. Mood again. Welcome back to Algebra 1. Today's lesson's over writing expressions. At the end of this lesson, you'll be able to use variables to write an algebraic expression. You'll also be able to determine if we're combining, separating, or comparing in a given situation. So the hardest part of writing an expression is figuring out if we're combining, separating, or comparing. Let's go over each one of those in detail. Let's start off with combining. How do we know if we're combining? If we're putting two things together, that means we're combining. We can do that in two ways. If we're combining once, then we're simply adding. For example, there were 100 players on the football team. On Thursday, more players joined. How many players are on the team? Well, first of all, we don't know how many players joined, so that's going to get a variable. That's going to be our blank, our placeholder. In this case, we're combining once because players joined. They only joined once. So we're going to do 100 plus our variable p for players joined. You can also combine equal groups. In that case, you're going to multiply. For example, I get paid $30 per hour. How much should I get this week? Well, what I don't know is how many hours I worked this week. So that's going to be our variable. We're going to say that's going to be h. Well, I'm going to continue to combine 30 over and over again. That's combining equal groups. So we're going to take 30 and h and we're going to multiply them together. 30h. Now, how do we know if we're separating? Separating means we're going to be taking things apart. And just like combining, you can do that in two different ways. If you're separating one time, we're going to simply subtract. For example, I had 1632 songs on my iPod, and I accidentally erased some. How many songs do I have left? Well, I don't know how many songs that I erased, so that's going to be our variable. We're going to call that e. Well, in this case, I lost some. I'm separating the number that I erased. I'm only doing that once. So 1632 minus e, the number of songs I erased. If you're separating things into equal groups, then you're dividing. For example, I have 4 buses for the field trip. How many students need to be on each bus? Well, I need to know how many students there are total, so we're going to call that our variable s. In this case, I want to know I'm going to make 4 equal groups of students, so I have to take the number of students and divide that by 4, so s divided by 4. And finally, we're going to talk about comparing. Comparing means we want to figure out how much bigger or smaller something is or how far apart two things are. We could compare in two different ways. If we want to know how many times bigger something is, then we have to divide. For example, Steve has 40 baseball cards. Jeff has B baseball cards. What is the ratio of Steve's cards to Jeff's cards? Well, we don't know how many cards Jeff has, but in order to figure out how many times more cards Steve has, we take the number of cards he has, 40, and divide it by the number of cards Jeff has, B. If Jeff had 10 cards, then 40 divided by 10 would be 4. Steve would have 4 times more cards than Jeff. So our expression here is 40 divided by B. If you're comparing to figure out exactly how much bigger something is or the distance between two things, then we subtract. For example, James has $40 and Jim has D dollars. How much more does James have? Well, we don't know how much money Jim has, so that's going to be a variable D. So we want to know how much more James has, so we're going to subtract the number of dollars that Jim has. So 40 minus D would be our expression here. So to wrap this up, when we're combining, we can either combine once, which means we're adding, or we can start combining equal groups, which means we're multiplying. If we're separating one time, then we're simply subtracting. If we're trying to separate something into equal groups, we have to divide. If we're comparing to see how many times bigger something is, then we have to divide. If we're comparing to see exactly how much bigger or how many spaces between two things, we have to subtract.
That's all, folks.